This shooting genius, who has only been learning to shoot for a few years and already knows all the professional shooters, he won a gold medal in shooting at the Athens Olympics in 2004. With his extraordinary skills and handsome appearance, Kang Chun was quickly on the cover of the newspapers. However, at this very moment, Kang Chun's family was mysteriously murdered. The police discovered that the weapon used in the crime was the gun Kang Chun used to compete in the Olympics in Greece, stained with the blood of his relatives and his fingerprints. Coincidentally, Kang Chun had just had an argument with his father the week before, so he was arrested as the prime suspect in the case. In the first trial, Kang Chun was sentenced to death. In the second trial, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, but eventually due to insufficient evidence, so he was released. However, the pain in his heart had not ended. People often pointed fingers at him and scrutinized him. Facing such a dark life, Kang Chun felt worse than death. Just as Kang Chun was about to jump off a bridge, he remembered the scene of his family being killed. Perhaps his life should not end so easily. He decided to find the real culprit. After 10 years of effort, Kang Chun opened an e-commerce trading company, becoming a super-rich tycoon with assets worth up to 800 billion won. However, on a windy night, a man in black suddenly appeared, brutally murdered Kang Chun. Such a dramatic life, and it has become a source of inspiration for the screenwriter. That's right, the story of Kang Chun's life comes from the famous comic book in the real world called W. The W comic series has incredibly high sales, became a hit on social media platforms. All readers hope that Kang Chun will find the culprit who killed his family. However, the author remained as stubborn as before. He had to write a death for the main character. What's even more strange is that after finishing the story's ending, the author disappeared into the night. Yet his group of students were still working outside the door, and they didn't hear any noise. The author's daughter, Yeonju, is a thoracic surgeon. Her superior professor is also a fan of the W series. To ingratiate the professor, Yeonju agreed to reveal the final chapter's ending to him. She ran to her father's workroom and then find out that her father had gone missing. Seeing Kang Chun lying in a pool of blood, she was extremely agitated. Suddenly, a bloody hand reached out from the screen and pulled her into another dimension. Yeonju, still bewildered and not understanding what was happening. The surrounding scene is identical to the W series. Before she could recover from the shock, she unexpectedly saw a severely injured man lying next to her feet. Yeonju called for help. She went to the kitchen to get a towel to clean the man's blood. But within 2 minutes, the man showed symptoms of shortness of breath, initially predicted to be due to chest pain. Yeonju had never performed chest surgery before. Seeing the man about to die from suffocation, she grabbed a pen from a service staff member and directly stabbed it into the man's chest, pulling him back from the brink of death. The rescue team quickly arrived. The hospital director asked for her name to express gratitude. Hearing that the injured man was his boss, the director panicked and rushed to check. Yeonju heard that the man's name was Kang Chun, but wasn't Kang Chun the name of the character in her father's series? Before she could understand anything, a line of white text appeared in the space, and the next second, she was back in the real world. Although she was lucky to return to reality, her father, aka the comic book author, had mysteriously disappeared. Even stranger that the story's initially ending was the main character would died, but it didn't stop there. A new character suddenly appeared in the comic, that is Yeonju. No mistake, all of Yeonju's actions after crossing into the second dimension appeared right in the comic. Two people in two worlds began to have some kind of connection. Kang Chun, who living in the comic world, continuously searches for Yeonju's whereabouts. He vaguely sensed that this girl named Yeonju will be the key to change his life. But what happens in the story, including the thoughts in Kang Chun's head, all appear before the reader's eyes. The author has not yet appeared, and the group of students all think that he has gone out and is now drawing more on his own. Although the plot is taking a very strange direction, but Yeonju said that her father was trapped in the story. This seems too absurd. Only her father could draw the characters, and moreover, the drawing style is exactly the same. While the author's student Subong is arguing with Yeonju, Yeonju's father suddenly returns. He says that the two recently released chapters were drawn by him, but he doesn't say where he has been. At some point in time, he discovered that the characters in the story had come to life, and the plot started to deviate from its original trajectory. It developed according to Kang Chun's will. Originally in the final chapter, Kang Chun was supposed to die, but unexpectedly Kang Chun was saved by the author's daughter. The author puts aside his worries and continues to make Kang Chun's death once again. He has a nurse replace the antibiotic with potassium and inject it into Kang Chun's veins. The author's student told Yeonju about this. Normally she wouldn't interfere with her father's work, but this time is different. The character in the story is still alive, and this action of her father equates to intentional murder. She intends to plead with her father to not do that, but he says the main character must avenge himself before he can die. Yeonju's father has already made up his mind. While they are arguing, Yeonju accidentally steps into the comic world again, her phone loses signal and a roadside screen announces the news that Kang Chun has recovered. The hospital in the comic looks exactly like the one in the real world, just with a different name. Yeonju easily finds the VIP hospital room. The nurse is now injecting potassium into Kang Chun's IV infusion, just as her father drew. Kang Chun is certainly supposed to die. Just at this moment, Yeonju arrives in time and pulls out the medical needle. In the real world, her father's comic book was also automatically developing based on Kang Chun's consciousness. Yeonju didn't know why she came here. She couldn't cooperate with the police investigation. She just wanted to quickly return to the real world, begged Kang Chun to let her leave the hospital. Even though Yeonju looked suspicious, sneaking around, and clearly making up stories, Kang Chun still gave her a phone. He said they would contact each other after he was discharged from hospital. Yeonju went back to the bus stop, thinking that she just have to wait for the words to be continued to appear. She would return to the real world. Yeonju hadn't yet calmed down, but 2 months had passed, and it was time for Kang Chun to leave the hospital. The reason time passed so quickly was that time in the comic world followed the plot at a time that is not very important for the main character. Everything changed very quickly. While Yeonju was still confused, Kang Chun drove up in a red sports car and stopped in front of her. He wanted to take her to a restaurant for lunch. He opened the car door, and Yeonju then followed him. He took her to a fancy shopping mall. Wherever they go, Kang Chun was always the center of attention, and everyone looked at Yeonju with envy. While Yeonju was changing clothes, she suddenly realized that, since this was a serialized comic, so it needed to be a plot twist to continue to the next episode, which would let her return to the real world, so she directly went up and slapped Kang Chun. However, Kang Chun didn't get angry, and he said the outfit suited her instead. A little while later, when realizing there was no change, she took a bold step and kissed Kang Chun. This time, the words, "to be continued," finally appeared. Yeonju hurriedly ran into the fitting room. She was still wearing that dress when she returned to the real world. She thought she had been missing for 2 months, but unexpectedly, just only 30 minutes had passed in the real world. Her kind colleague helped Yeonju remove the tag from the new dress, which was priced at 3,550,000 won, a cost that shocked anyone who heard it. The new chapter was updated rapidly. New plot twists kept fans on the edge of their seats. The sudden change in the story's style, the scene when Yeonju kissed the male lead, was well received by readers who loved this kind of romantic twist. They eagerly wait for the new chapter every day. But then the editor unexpectedly received the manuscript while the office was still in the process of creating the new chapter. While the students was still confused about how this happened, the author suddenly flew into a rage. He demanded the publishing company to retract the newly published chapter and temporarily disbanded the office. He moved into a hotel room to continue his work. In his creation, he is the god, and since the characters had gone beyond his control, he decided to destroy the story at all costs. He caused a car accident to happen to Kang Chun. However, at the moment when Kang Chun was close to death, everything in the comic world froze. Once he avoided the accident, the world returned to normal. Kang Chun realized that someone in the shadows was controlling his fate. The author's screen also changed to the real time. Eventually, who is that? Kang Chun's biggest question now was why he kept facing danger. The truth was that the author's psychological state and Kang Chun's experiences in the story were closely linked. The plot of Kang Chun jumping off a bridge happened during the author's divorce, the time when he felt utterly hopeless. He lost all motivation to continue creating the comic, and he were planning to end the story with Kang Chun's death. But strangely, when the author woke up the next day, he found that Kang Chun was still alive in the comic. Kang Chun had held onto the railing with one hand all night long. The author thought he might have remembered it wrong due to being drunk, but the scene of Kang Chun striving to survive inspired him. The author not only saved Kang Chun, but also gave him a worthy life, let him buy a TV station, invest a huge amount of money to create a crime program called W. They began to investigate the murderer without any fear, and in real life, the author Sang-hoon also became famous and wealthy thanks to the huge success of the W webtoon. Both his life and Kang Chun's reached new heights. However, strange things began to happen. Sometimes the comic wouldn't follow Sang-hoon's intentions, as if Kang Chun was expressing dissatisfaction with the story. Additionally, almost every day there were drawings Sang-hoon had never seen before being created. He could sense that the characters in his comic are still alive. He feared that one day, the characters might try to kill him. Instead of waiting for death, he decided to take action. Since the time when Sang-hoon arranged for Kang Chun to jump off the bridge, everything went off course. His daughter got pulled into the comic. To escape the comic world, Yeonju gave Kang Chun a kiss. The W comic had such a large fan base that you could see them anywhere. They were all excited by the kiss scene. Yeonju couldn't hold her head up in public. The blurring lines between the comic and reality exhausted her, and she fainted right at the bus stop. This incident pulled her back into the comic world once again. She were lying motionless in the fitting room. When Kang Chun heard news of Yeonju, he immediately turned his car around, took her to a hotel. Since Kang Chun doesn't have a home, he always stayed in a luxurious penthouse. That night, when Yeonju fainted, the man in black appeared again and then and pointed a gun at Kang Chun to prevent Yeonju from getting hurt. Kang Chun pushed the man in black outside to fight him, but after the man in black ran into the elevator and then mysteriously disappeared. On the other side, author Sang-hoon failed in his attempt once again. He was so enraged that he smashed the electronic drawing board with a fire extinguisher. After being unconscious for 2 days, Yeonju finally woke up. Seeing the see-through lingerie near the sink made her extremely anxious. Maybe Kang Chun doesn't have such strange hobbies, right? But she didn't think about it too much. To see the words, "to be continued as soon as possible," she decided to take a risky step. Yeonju suddenly started undressing in front of Kang Chun. Kang Chun asked what she was trying to do. It was 11 a.m. What you wanted to do with me? Being the Kang Chun from the best-selling comic, there wasn't a scene he hadn't encountered before. Kang Chun grabbed a gun, then loaded it and pointed it at Yeonju, demanded her to answers to all of his questions, such as why she suddenly kissed him. Yeonju explained that last time she had to kiss him to disappear, which sounded like a ridiculous lie to fool children. Seeing is believing, so Kang Chun stepped forward and kissed Yeonju, but this time nothing happened. The storyline changes according to the main character's inner feelings. Yeonju was put in a difficult situation again. Kang Chun raised his gun and shot the vase behind her. His secretary and bodyguard heard the gunshot. They advised him to hand Yeonju over to the police. However, Kang Chun was very determined. He forced Yeonju to tell the truth. As he counted to 10, he pulled the trigger and the bullet passed through her body. Yeonju was too terrified. She directly fainted. It seemed like she wasn't aware of her extraordinary abilities, but Kang Chun had long suspected that Yeonju came from a different dimension, or a parallel universe. So that's why she had an immortal body. Before Yeonju answered all of his questions, she had to stay in this world. The police and media were hunting for Yeonju, so Yeonju could only live in the penthouse as if she is under house arrest. Before Kang Chun went on a business trip, Yeonju couldn't help but run over to told him to be careful. Kang Chun was curious and asked her, but she didn't answer, why she was worried about his safety. Yeonju explained that she only wished for a happy ending for his life. Kang Chun then asked her how old she was, and Yeonju said she was 30 years old. Furthermore, she's unmarried. After hearing this, Kang Chun felt so delighted inside. The closer Kang Chun was to Yeonju, the closer he felt to the real world. According to the investigation, the large truck that almost caused an accident with Kang Chun's car had disappeared. The nurse who secretly swapped the medication didn't know why she did it. Kang Chun believed things they've told were true. On the night Kang Chun was assassinated, someone also called him too, then arranged him to meet on the rooftop. Kang Chun had known that it's dangerous, but he still went alone without bodyguards. He believed anything that others said. Everything he did seemed very vague, and he almost got killed by the man in black. Kang Chun began to suspect. He had always tried hard to find the culprit, but maybe because there is a parallel world out there. At the same time, in the comic world, Yeonju had no official role. She always appeared unexpectedly whenever Kang Chun was in danger. Everyone, including the police, was searching for this mysterious figure. Therefore, so he who is the female lead of the comic began to feel unhappy. She invited Yeonju to a bar on the rooftop and called security to expose her in front of everyone. Yeonju sensed something was off and tried to escape, but the police chased her down. When Kang Chun got informed, he called his bodyguard to help her, but it was too late. Before she was captured, Yeonju threw her phone to the bodyguard to avoid involving Kang Chun. Due to a series of unusual actions, Yeonju became the prime suspect in the case. Under intense police interrogation, she became distressed. Yeonju didn't know how to answer them. She could only remain silent. Then she was charged as an accomplice and sent to prison. Kang Chun understood this feeling well. He also went from being the victim to becoming a suspect in the case. People always judge things by appearances, and it wasn't easy for him to get to where he was today. The secretary once again played the innocent victim. Without thinking much, Kang Chun immediately fired her. He then went to visit Yeonju in prison. In this world, Yeonju had no future. Everyone saw her as a criminal, and she had to face numerous investigations and trials. The only way out for Yeonju was to reveal the whole story and then return home. After long hesitation, Yeonju finally told them everything about Kang Chun's life in the comic. The words "to be continued" appeared, and Yeonju disappeared right before Kang Chun's eyes. She spent a week in the comic world, but just only 30 minutes had passed in the real world. Her disappearance caused a riot in the comic world. After keeping watch, the police saw Yeonju suddenly disappeared in a puff of smoke with their own eyes. But who would believe such bizarre tales? If Yeonju were pulled into the comic world again, she might be shot or end up in prison for life. Regardless of the outcome, she couldn't escape a tragic fate. There was still no news from author Sang-hoon. One of his students decided to alter the drawings, erase the words "to be continued," and bring the entire story to an end. But Unexpectedly, the drawing board turned completely blank. Yeonju said that perhaps Kang Chun was dissatisfied with everything. There were no clues at all. In this crazy conversation, there were clues. When Kang Chun realized that the world he was living in was fictional, and the moment he was realizing everything, time in the comic froze for everyone except him. Everything suddenly stopped, as if only he remained in the story. Like a punishment for the awakened, a screen appeared before his eyes. Kang Chun tried to reach into it. Suddenly he remembered that on the night he was dying, he had reached through the screen and pulled Yeonju towards him to find the murderer of his parents. Kang Chun stepped into the real world. His portrait was made into many posters and stuck on display windows here. Kang Chun is a star adored by thousands in the second dimension. When he came to the bookstore, he saw everything that happened to him from a godlike perspective. Those who loved him unconditionally and those who were so jealous of him that they saw him as a thorn in their side. After hearing from the staff that the W comic series had been a bestseller for many years, Kang Chun could only smile bitterly. He went to the hospital where Yeonju worked. When a colleague said someone is looking for Yeonju, she initially didn't care, but who would have thought that this time it wasn't she who stepped into the comic world, but the one from the comic who came to the real world to find her. Kang Chun's world had stopped, and only he could escape. Recalling Yeonju's silence back then, he found her kindness and thoughtfulness touching. He came to see Yeonju just to say goodbye one last time. Yeonju knew well that being in a place without money, home, or identity was very panicked. She now has an urgent surgery to perform, so she told Kang Chun to wait there. Not only did Kang Chun not listen to her, but he also went to the author's house. Right in this office room, the author had created Kang Chun and his world. His sports car and his house, even his hairstyle and appearance, were all through multiple drafts and revisions. A world that he once believed it was real is now on those drawings. Kang Chun was completely shattered and devastated. More surprisingly, the person who had saved him from danger again and again is the author's daughter. This explained why Yeonju always knew of impending danger and arrived just in time to save him. The author Sang-hoon dragged his weary body home. Upon receiving a call from his daughter, he saw the main character from his comic standing in the flesh before him. Sang-hoon was so shocked he couldn't speak. Once Sang-hoon gathered his wits, he grabbed a box cutter and rushed straight towards. But Kang Chun, who drawn by him to be incredibly strong, Kang Chun easily overpowered the old man in just 2 moves and pushed him down onto a chair. Blood oozed from Sang-hoon's head. Even in Sang-hoon's own world, he still couldn't be the master. Like Kang Chun, Sang-hoon was just an ordinary person. On the day Kang Chun was assassinated by the man in black, the first person he pulled through the screen was Sang-hoon. However, not only did Sang-hoon not save Kang Chun, but also ruthlessly stabbed him. Sang-hoon put Kang Chun in a critical condition. The author had a love-hate relationship with his character. He loved Kang Chun because he had created Kang Chun with all his aspirations, such as talent, appearance, capability, and success, then created a perfect Kang Chun character. But Kang Chun came to life with his own thoughts and actions, and even dragged Sang-hoon into the comic. Sang-hoon had to endure torment and suffering. Even his friends who were doctors thought he was insane, yet he persisted in drawing. As people enjoyed dramatic plot twists, so he drew a life full of ups and downs for Kang Chun. He wanted to wait until he had made enough money to secure his daughter's future. However, Kang Chun got involved with his daughter, which crossed the author's line. He repeatedly created accidents to end Kang Chun's life. From this standpoint, it's hard to distinguish right from wrong. Now Kang Chun desires nothing. He just wants the author to return his world to its original state and to draw the true culprit who killed his family so he can live a normal life again. But Sang-hoon can't do it because the culprit Kang Chun had been searching for all this time doesn't exist. It was merely a plot to make the main character stronger and was just a tool to advance the story. Even Sang-hoon doesn't know what the culprit looks like. This baseless truth only brought Kang Chun more misery. It was all just part of the storyline, but the pain of losing his loved ones and being ostracized and looked down on was real. Catching the culprit was his lifelong goal. After a lot of difficulty, he finally got close to the truth, only for the author to nonchalantly tell him that the culprit didn't exist. Kang Chun wiped away his tears and gave up. He asked the author to find a way to return him to his world. Just as Kang Chun was about to leave, Sang-hoon boldly said, "You can't shoot me, that's your character setup." This provocative speech caused Kang Chun to lose control. He aimed his gun at the author again, and this time he fired. A student who had just arrived at the gate after hearing the gunshot was terrified. Kang Chun deeply hated those with an always superior attitude, but the bitter truth was that even he had to admit the author was right. He wasn't a murderer. Before leaving, Kang Chun told the student to call for an ambulance. Sang-hoon was taken to the hospital where Yeonju worked. The surgeon Jin, who was that huge fan of the comic W, he successfully removed the bullet from Sang-hoon's body. By then, news of the author being shot had spread across the media. Meanwhile, the scriptwriter once again received the latest chapter of the comic. They didn't publish it immediately, as they felt something was very odd about the content. They sent the drawings to Yeonju, and the plot was exactly the same as reality. It was drawn that Kang Chun stepping out from the comic, killing the author and jumping off a bridge to end his life. This was the end of the story. He saw the short and clear words written on the poster: "The defender of justice for this generation. Will he find the one who killed his family?" Kang Chun felt only bitterness and irony. He wrote a farewell letter to Yeonju, saying goodbye to the one he loved. His life was just a fictional story after all. He had wanted to find the real culprit, but now he became a murderer himself. There was no more fitting ending. Finally, he jumped off the Han River Bridge. By the time Yeonju arrived, the water had already calmed, and Kang Chun was nowhere to be seen. The gun that Kang Chun had taken from the comic world and the bullet taken out from the author's body had completely disappeared. Such a strange and tragic ending caused an uproar on the internet. Every day, the comic company received thousands of complaint calls, and readers even gathered to demand justice for Kang Chun. They wanted a change to the story's ending. Yeonju tried to convince others, and convince herself too, that it was all just a comic, so people shouldn't get too emotional. However, she still kept track of Kang Chun's whereabouts. When a student informed her that the police had found a drowned body a few days ago, she rushed to identify it. Fortunately, it wasn't Kang Chun. She could only console herself with the thought that Kang Chun had disappeared because he had returned to the comic world. In fact, the author had once considered bringing Kang Chun back to life. Kang Chun's death had touched his heart, but he couldn't continue drawing. The farewell letter was also given to Yeonju, who living in the real world, so W ended that way. 2 months later, the professor arranged a blind date for Yeonju. Her date seemed quite impressive and really liked Yeonju. She sneaked into the bathroom to chat with a colleague, but suddenly her phone lost signal and water gradually submerged her. She was pulled into the Han River by something, and she saw Kang Chun. At the moment of his death, time had frozen, and he was sinking into the cold river. She hurried back to reality and checked the last chapter of the comic, only to find that the word end had turned into ever. To be continued, Yeonju begged the student to save Kang Chun. The problem was that although Subong had studied drawing with the author for 3 years, but this character was ultimately not his creation. He tried, but to no avail. Yeonju felt helpless. Initially, the creator of the character Kang Chun wasn't the author, but Yeonju, a shooting prodigy with a cute face. This was the image of Kang Chun in the comic, and this character design originated from when Yeonju was a child. She was inspired by the Olympic shooting competition, and she used her pen to draw Kang Chun. This is also why there was a connection between her and him before his death, as she's the first person to create and also a devoted fan of Kang Chun. Yeonju wished for Kang Chun to have a better life than anyone else. To revive Kang Chun, she picked up her pen and changed the ending where he jumped into the river. Her fingers blistered. Finally, her hard work paid off. Time in the comic resumed. She arranged for a rescue team to save Kang Chun and brought him back to life. She also entered the comic world once more. Yeonju fainted in the cell room where she had disappeared last time. After the main character Kang Chun entered the real world, time in the comic was frozen. Over 2 months had passed in the real world, but for them only a day had gone by. On the way to transferring Yeonju to another prison, Kang Chun stopped the car. He asked Yeonju why he had been saved. Yeonju played coy. She refused to tell him. From now on, Kang Chun's life was no longer the work of the author Sang-hoon. Yeonju intended to write a romantic story with him in the next chapters. Was Kang Chun happy when he knew the truth? No, everything in his life had been orchestrated by someone else. This realization filled him with deep sorrow. He hated the attitude of the author, because while he was alive, the author had devised countless ways to kill him. But now, how ironical, when he wanted to end his life, the author's daughter saved him. He then visited the prison to talk to Yeonju, telling her that she should have continued working at the hospital and dating someone else. Why did you do this? Why did you cling to this wretched story and end up handcuffed here? Yeonju directly replied, "Because I love you." This unexpected love confession moved Kang Chun deeply. "I'm so scared that I would never see you again." After unlocking the handcuff kiss position, despite sleeping in prison, Yeonju still felt an unusual sense of happiness. To get Yeonju out of prison without attracting the police's attention, Kang Chun decided to enter into a fake marriage with her. Thus, they registered for an international marriage and became legally married. This explained Yeonju's presence on the rooftop the night Kang Chun was assassinated, or why the police requested an investigation into her escape. It was all to protect their secret marriage from being exposed. They don't want the public to know about it. Yeonju then was released from prison. Kang Chun even gave a wedding ring to her. They had 2 of anythings in their home, and Kang Chun did his best to fulfill the romance Yeonju desired. He frequently bought books for reference. friends. When they lay together reading, it was very affectionate until a bodyguard unexpectedly appeared and broke the romantic atmosphere. However, when Kang Chun was in the elevator, he received a call from an unknown number. 2 lines of text appeared, asking him where he was and how he had come back to life. It was clear that the caller was the culprit who had killed his family 10 years ago, the mysterious man in black. The culprit, who was thought to be non-existent, had appeared. Kang Chun immediately became alert. He realized that the real culprit still existed. However, the author had never sketched his appearance. Therefore, the culprit had no face or identity. He was created solely to kill Kang Chun's family. He had no personality. He appeared and disappeared according to the plot. He could kill people freely without any constraints. When Kang Chun thought of Yeonju being shot in the head, he was very anxious. As Yeonju was preparing to cook for him, she accidentally cut her hand. The person who had survived bullets before was now injured by a small knife. Everything had variables. It turned out that in the comic world, Yeonju had a new identity. She's now the female lead, which meant she had lost her immortality. During this tense moment, the words "to be continued" appeared, and Yeonju returned to the real world. Since Kang Chun made his marriage public, secretary, so he was very sad. After drinking, she cried and called Kang Chun. Then she suddenly discovered that her hand and phone had become transparent. Kang Chun rushed to So-hee's house. He organized his thoughts on the way. Every character appeared due to the demands of the storyline. Once they lost their reason for existing, they would disappear from the comic world. So-hee existed to be by Kang Chun's side, but now that Kang Chun had Yeonju, So-hee had lost her reason to exist. Besides the culprit possibly being similar to Kang Chun, he also has his own consciousness. He came to the real world to find Kang Chun, and he is aware of the connection between the fictional world and the real world. Discovering that he is just a fictional character made him extremely angry. Since Kang Chun jumped off the bridge until the story showed signs of ending, the culprit had not once appeared. Because he has no physical form, so he came and went without leaving any trace. A character without personality in the story, stepping into the real world, he is also an unorganized killer. When he suddenly appeared before Yeonju, he fired a shot through the car window and the bullet grazed her forehead. At the moment Yeonju almost got shot, she quickly entered the comic world. Yeonju managed to escape. She could quickly move between the two worlds, which is her greatest power. The author was terrified, so he chose to flee. However, the culprit who killed Kang Chun's family attacked the author in the airplane restroom. The killer had only 3 questions: who I am, where am I, and where is Kang Chun? He strangled the author to force him to answer his questions. Meanwhile, in the comic world, Kang Chun was rushing to the secretary's house. He rang the doorbell, but no one answered. The secretary character was created by Sang-boon's student, who liked to associate everything with his idol. Even the secretary's door code was changed to the last 4 digits of the student's phone number. After Yeonju revealed the code, Kang Chun successfully opened the door. He told Yeonju to wait outside. When the secretary saw the wedding ring on Kang Chun's finger, she began to act coquettish. Kang Chun could only comfort her and explain that it was just a fake marriage, that there was nothing between them. The secretary said that Kang Chun was very important to her. Originally, Yeonju had only been listening outside, but when the secretary's hands and feet began to disappear, Yeonju anxiously ran in. She finally saw a touching scene right before her eyes. After Kang Chun emphasized the importance of the secretary in his life, her body began to return to normal. Yeonju remained silent. She applied medicine to Sully. So-hee, the secretary's reason for existence, was Kang Chun. Her life always revolved around him. This was a character who destined to die in the story. Kang Chun's actions might be understandable, but Yeonju also felt bitter inside. To protect the comic world and Yeonju, Kang Chun had come up with a plan. He asked Yeonju, once she returned to the real world, to reset the storyline so that everything would go back to the point before they met. This way, the culprit wouldn't leave the comic world to harm anyone. He gave Yeonju a USB drive, asked her to give it to the author, and told her to forget him. He was just a character in a comic. He said that if she ever missed him, she could visit the bookstore and see him in the story. After that, Kang Chun jumped from the building. The comic world was reset, and Kang Chun lost all memories of Yeonju. Earlier, he had given Yeonju the USB, which contained some attachments and a letter to the author. He was ready to accept the damned fate the author had given him. He hoped the author would create a happy ending for W Comic, and for the sake of his daughter's safety, Kang Chun had meticulously planned for W Comic. He hoped the author would give the culprit a face and identity. The author decided to create a character that Kang Chun would believe was the culprit. Although Kang Chun no longer cared about the real world, but with his high IQ, he would detect any loophole, and the two worlds could not avoid chaos. The student had initially decided to give up creating comics and return to his hometown, as all the strange occurrences were too much to bear. But when he heard that the author wanted to write a happy ending, he willingly picked up his tools again, following Kang Chun's wishes. The initial plan was that the person who assassinated Kang Kang Chun on the rooftop was a delivery man, because on the night Kang Chun was attacked, the author appeared on the rooftop and stabbed Kang Chun. He was the prime suspect that Kang Chun saw. The author decided to make the culprit's face resemble his own face, then end the story without letting Kang Chun, who had lost his memory, suspect anything. After burying the clues, Kang Chun would publicly reveal the culprit's face on a TV program and capture the culprit with the help of the public. The culprit was set up to be Kang Chun's father's teammate when they were sport shooter. Because that teammate was suffering from paranoid delusions, he felt oppressed by Kang Chun's father, so he has the motive to kill Kang Chun's father. Evidences were found in his house. Facing with his own crimes, he could not deny anything. To prevent future troubles, the murderer had to disappear from the comic world, preferably killed by a villain for a satisfying ending. The culprit was caught. Previously, the congressman wanted to enter politics, so he had tried to kill Kang Chun. He directly contacted the underworld to kill the culprit and staged it as the culprit had ended his life himself, and then stuffed a piece of paper into the culprit's hand to blame for Kang Chun. Eventually, the gangster was arrested and confessed about the congressman. The culprit was dead, the congressman imprisoned, evil was punished. In the end, author focused on the romantic story of Kang Chun. He would continue with the secretary, who is his childhood friend, give readers a sense of a happy ending. That completes the story's ending. However, this was just a plan. The culprit found out this plan, and of course he wouldn't sit still. He had always followed the author's orders to kill Kang Chun's family and being a tool to make Kang Chun stronger. But now the author teamed up with Kang Chun to kill him, making him feel betrayed. This time he wanted the author to follow his orders. He extended his hands, not only having the author's face and voice, but also manipulating the author's consciousness and actions. The culprit took advantage of the author to rampage freely. In the comic world, when the culprit already had a face, he eagerly went to Kang Chun's TV station to cause trouble, resulting in many casualties. He even showed his face in front of the camera. The real culprit now had a physical form. He was an ordinary person in the comic world. He manipulated the author and existed like a king. After the TV broadcast of the shooting at the TV station, Yeonju was once again drawn into the comic world. All the doctors and nurses were rushing around to provide emergency care, and the hospital was in utter chaos. The direction of the story left Yeonju feeling extremely bewildered. At this moment, Kang Chun grabbed her hand and pulled her towards a patient who had been shot in the leg. As the patient cried out in pain, Yeonju stared blankly at Kang Chun for a long time until she was scolded by him. Someone recognized that she wasn't a hospital staff member and wanted to question her, so Yeonju quickly left. After helping out at another hospital, she went up to the rooftop to catch her breath. The culprit from 10 years ago had reappeared and caused numerous incidents. Kang Chun was extremely stressed. He also went up to the rooftop to unwind. He asked Yeonju why she kept staring at him. Just then he received a call from his secretary and left immediately. Although Yeonju was just a minor character in the story, she had been in the comic world for over a week without money or a place to stay or an identity. She had to go to places that gave out free food to stave off hunger and secretly ate 2 ice creams from the fridge. Desperately, she sneaked into So Hee's house, intending to cook some noodles, take a bath, and steal some money. Unexpectedly, Kang Chun also came to the secretary's house, seemingly to retrieve something for her. Seeing the pot of boiling water on the stove, Kang Chun knew someone was inside. He kicked the door open forcefully. This sight would make anyone hide in shame. Kang Chun was really considerate. Seeing Yeonju's burned lips, he immediately took out some ointment and applied it to her lips himself. However, this gentle act only made Yeonju even sadder. She told him to stop caring for her like that. She said she had tried her best to avoid him, even sleeping on the streets for over a week, just to avoid causing trouble for him. But why did he keep appearing and caring for her so nicely? He was making Yeonju feel confused. She was always the one initiating everything, even the Remper. "I love you" was something she never heard from him. The grievances and frustrations poured out. Initially, Kang Chun wanted to hand Yeonju over to the police, but he began to regret it. He always thought he had done something wrong. He took Yeonju to the hospital and visited the injured employee. The man told Kang Chun that he had received a recording. That's the recording of Kang Chun's father and Kang Chun arguing after Kang Chun had been drinking, and then a gunshot. It was Kang Chun's father's friend. This man had always cared for and trusted Kang Chun completely, but after hearing this recording, his faith wavered. This recording was clearly something the culprit forced the author to create to reverse the situation, even though it sounds so baseless. But the characters in the story didn't know that. Just as the man was questioning Kang Chun, a bullet suddenly flew straight into him from somewhere, and he died instantly. Suddenly, a gun appeared in Kang Chun's hand, and the police coincidentally saw this scene. The victim instantly became the perpetrator. Kang Chun couldn't explain, so he had to run away. While fleeing, he was shot. Yeonju didn't understand what was happening. She took the wheel for him. When they stopped at a pharmacy to buy medicine, she saw the news rumors about Kang Chun killing the employee, and only then did she understand that the original plan between her father and Kang Chun had failed. The comic world had completely shifted according to the culprit's will. It is now governed by evil. She used Kang Chun's money to rent a secluded hotel room, intentionally choosing a less noticeable one. After stopping Kang Chun's bleeding, she decided to return to the real world to get to the bottom of things. Something must have happened. Kang Chun's current situation was terrible. She was the only one who could fight the culprit. After another kiss, Yeonju seemed to fall in love with him once again. She ran out the door and stepped into the real world. When she got home to check on her father, she found the door wide open. Her father had his back turned to her and was silent. Yeonju cautiously approached and she was horrified. She saw Sang-boon's facial features had been erased. His entire face looked like it had been pulled down by someone. Yeonju screamed out and ran out quickly. Then she called Sang-boon's student, who was also looking for her. He also didn't know why the author's face had become so distorted, but one thing was certain, that the culprit had taken control of Sang-boon's body. Despite her fear, Yeonju decided to sneak into her father's office again. As she was about to grab the drawing board, her dad suddenly grabbed her hand, then turned his grotesque and blurred face towards her. Meanwhile, in the comic world, the police were investigating the hotel where Kang Chun was staying. Kang Chun heard the sounds, he endured the pain, and took the gun out of his pocket, determined to fight to the death if necessary. In this dangerous moment, the blood stains in the room and the door were erased. The surveillance camera footage in the elevator were deleted too. Then the colors and numbers on the license plates of the cars were changed. It turned out that to prevent the police from finding Kang Chun, Yeonju had locked her dad outside. She were drawing in the office and endured her fear alone. She drew a treatment for gunshot wounds and detailed the healing process. It's really magic pen in a Korean version. Kang Chun woke up to the sound of an alarm. He saw some supplies on the table, had been facing so many strange incidents, so he was used to it. Following Yeonju's written instructions, he treated his wound without anesthesia, took the bullet out himself, and used staples to close the injury. The fake recording convinced the public that Kang Chun was the culprit who murdered his own family. Additionally, the sudden appearance of a gun in his hand made him the prime suspect in the death of the employee. Now Kang Chun had become a despised figure, akin to a rat scurrying through the streets. His previous acts of justice were now seen as mere show and deceit. In this world controlled by the murderer, he became a fugitive. He is destined to die. Gradually, his hands began to disappear and he was brought closer to death. Just as Yeonju was altering Kang Chun's fate, the murderer reached out of the screen to strangle her. She managed to resist and turned off the drawing board, prevented the murderer from intervening in the real world. However, she was now conflicted. If she turned on the drawing board, the murderer could wreak havoc through the screen, but if she didn't, she couldn't change the story's direction and couldn't help Kang Chun. While discussing with the student, Yeonju was pulled into the comic world again, this time appearing in the politician's office. The politician was searching for her and planning to kill Kang Chun. According to witnesses, after the employee's death, Kang Chun had been seen in a car with a strange girl. Yeonju didn't have time to think. She quickly fled the office while she were trying to calm herself down. The story had completely deviated now, villains becoming the protagonists. The politician was hunting Yeonju, and she had appeared in his office, although Kang Chun's memory had been erased. But she was still pulled into the comic world. This means the murderer had pulled her in. Whenever she asked about Kang Chun, she would be cursed. No one knew the truth. Everyone considered Kang Chun a sinner. They believed what they saw. Time had changed again, and a month had gone by. Yeonju hurried to the hotel, the door she had erased gone, and no sounds came from the other side of the wall. People said Kang Chun had been shot dead while escaping. Yeonju couldn't believe it. While she was so distraught, she saw the bodyguard. Yeonju asked about Kang Chun. The bodyguard saw her crying, so he gave her an address and asked her to persuade Kang Chun to surrender. After waiting at the bus stop for half a day, Yeonju finally saw Kang Chun. She had mixed emotions and didn't know what to say. Kang Chun noticed his room's door was gone. The colors and numbers of his car's license plate had changed. Kang Chun had seen the gun suddenly appear in his hand with his own eyes. He's now familiar with these bizarre events. Yeonju had become his only family. Despite his accounts being frozen and his phone out of money, he still wants to buy her new clothes. They shop together. They not only buy clothes, but also feed each other ice cream and buying groceries before going home to cook. Yeonju had once said she wanted to continue their love story, living carefree days with the person she liked. Isn't this some kind of romance right now? Although Kang Chun had forgotten his memories of Yeonju, he hadn't entirely forgotten. Why? Because he had a W comic book, coincidentally the contents of which were his lost memories. This reignited the comic world. Despite their meticulous plan, Kang Chun and the author had missed a step. The comic book in his hand was the one that Yeonju had brought from the real world by chance. For some reason, the book ended up in his hands. As he flipped through it, he vividly remembered the plot and dialogues. Although his memories hadn't fully returned, he could deduce what had happened between two main characters. Perhaps this is the past of Kang Chun and Yeonju. He was now a fugitive accused of murder. He has no room for other thoughts. The worst outcome for him would be a life sentence. But after reading the comic, he wanted to uncover the truth. This was why he refused to surrender. While they were talking, the door linking reality and the comic world appeared again. Kang Chun pulled Yeonju right into the author's office. When Yeonju saw her father's grotesque face, she was heartbroken. She were living two different lives between reality and the comic world, and determined to clear Kang Chun's name. The difference between the two worlds is too great. Yeonju was so exhausted she fainted. Her colleague took her to the hospital, while Kang Chun borrowed a screwdriver from the student, dismantled the drawing board and reassembles it when needed, to prevent the murderer from causing more trouble. As one of the creators of W, the student is a huge fan of Kang Chun too, that he was so thrilled, he shaked hands with his idol. The path for the murderer to freely travel between the two worlds was cut off. Kang Chun spent 2 days reading the entire comic and also read the initial plan he had written for the author. Then he reassembled the drawing board and powered it on. He took the gun, faced the murderer. The murderer was trapped in his own room, time frozen. He was a crazy killer, but there are no more people around to kill. But he wasn't scared, because he was now the main character, and Kang Chun was a superfluous person, destined to disappear. He was confident he would outlive Kang Chun. He believed the comic world would continue to revolve around him after Kang Chun's death. He just needed to wait for Kang Chun to disappear. The next morning, Kang Chun visited Yeonju. When Yeonju went into the dressing room, Kang Chun noticed the comic strips stuck on the window. Since he had lost his memories, he could calmly accept the fate that had been predetermined for him. However, Yeonju couldn't. She could see him, but couldn't show that she knew him, because they belonged to two different worlds, so she could only replay the memories they shared. Now looking back, she realized how cruel that was. If Kang Chun was just an ordinary citizen in the real world, the two of them could have a romantic relationship like any other couple. Kang Chun borrowed a sum of money to fund the love project, and using the student's name to buy a SIM card, so he could call Yeonju as much as he wanted. It seemed like a sweet love story was about to start again. Yeonju knew that Kang Chun would soon disappear, so her smile was extremely forced. Kang Chun aware of her concerns, so he no longer hid the truth, because he had discovered why his plan had failed. That night on the rooftop, there were two people who stabbed him. One was the author, and the other was the murderer who killed his family. The murderer always considers Kang Chun as the target to hunt down, so when another person appeared and wanted to hunt Kang Chun as well, the murderer sensed something strange, and then he deduced the identity of the author. He knew the comic world was fictional even before Kang Chun did. The fate of comic characters was entirely created by the author's pen, so the murderer struck a deal with the author. The murderer has an IQ that is no less than Kang Chun's. He agreed to let the author return to the real world, but the author had to meet his two conditions. First was to give him a face, and second was to let him kill Kang Chun and become the main character in the comic world. The author quickly agreed, but once he returned the real world, he reneged on the deal. Not only that, he conspired with Kang Chun to kill the murderer. Upon discovering this, the murderer was furious. He directly took away the author's face. The author had hidden the fact that he had met the murderer, and that led to the failure of all their plans. Only once the murderer was killed could the author take back his face. Kang Chun had lost his status as the main character, and he didn't know when he would disappear, so he chose to follow his original plan. Kang Chun would capture the real murderer and have the congressman kill him afterward, but the ending would change a bit. He wanted to alter the ending the author had drawn. The final scene should be Kang Chun and Yeonju getting married and living happily, which would be the perfect ending for W comic. At this point, the responsibility of protecting Yeonju's father fell on Kang Chun. The author was not a god. He couldn't create everything in that world. This didn't make sense at all. He could only control a few characters he had drawn. On the contrary, the passersby were the most free characters. Thus, Kang Chun came to the conclusion that the comic world and the real world were two independent worlds. The author's comic just acted as a bridge between the two worlds. But there was a difference. Everything in the comic world was based on the real world. For instance, the architectural structures in the comic world, they were all taken from real buildings. Kang Chun asked Subong to keep an ear out for the murderer's address. Subong was responsible for drawing the scenery and background, but before he could draw the specific address, the author was already controlled by the murderer. Nevertheless, Subong still kept the photos of the real apartment as reference material. The number 8115 outside the apartment had no special significance. After understanding everything, Kang Chun began to carry out his plan. He sent a message to Yeonju, told her to turn on the tablet 10 minutes later. That will open the connection between the two worlds. Once he finished, he would be able to return to the real world. At the moment Kang Chun began summoning himself, he did indeed arrive in the murderer's room. The murderer was shocked and lunged at Kang Chun. However, now that the murderer had a physical body, so he had lost his ability to teleport like before. After all, the murderer's body now was just a man in 50 50s. How could he overpower a young and strong man like Kang Chun? The fight didn't last long before the murderer was knocked down. Kang Chun tied murderer to a sofa so he couldn't move. Then Kang Chun called the police, informing them that he had found the murderer responsible for the television station incident. He then drove away in the car Yeonju had drawn for him. But Yeonju still needed to draw two scenes. First is Kang Chun's decomposed corpse. The murderer faked the recording of the argument and killed Kang Chun's family, then shamelessly put all the blame on Kang Chun. Next is the unexplained gunshot incident that defied logical explanation. Even though all are victims, but Kang Chun couldn't prove his innocence. Instead, he was accused of being a murderer, cursed by the public day after day, and had to hide like a rat in a corner. Kang Chun would rather fake his own death. This way he would vanish from everyone's memory. And by the way, the preset storyline involving the secretary would be eliminated. She wouldn't have to revolve around Kang Chun anymore, and she could be safe. Another item to draw was the ring Kang Chun had lost. So from now on, he could live happily with Yeonju. The second hypothesis was that he was summoned to the real world. When a task in one episode was completed, he could return to the real world. If the hypothesis succeeded, he would become a new supreme being. But things weren't that simple. Although Kang Chun died in this story, he restored his honor as the main character, accomplished the purpose of catching the murderer, and escaped the threat of disappearing. However, an unexpected event occurred. When Kang Chun drove past the hotel that served as the comic's model, he suddenly saw the secretary standing at the entrance. Even stranger, the secretary saw him. Kang Chun quickly called Yeonju to confirm if he was still in the comic world. She assured him he wasn't. Comic characters couldn't be summoned to the real world. This seemed impossible. Or maybe Kang Chun had accidentally summoned the character into the real world. Kang Chun suddenly had a bad feeling. Meanwhile, thanks to Kang Chun, the murderer escaped from the police station and killed a police officer in the real world. After stealing a car and a gun, the murderer went straight to the author's office, manipulated the author again, and tricked Yeonju into the comic world. To prevent Kang Chun from altering the story plot, the murderer forced the author to smash the tablet so they wouldn't have any escape route. When Kang Chun returned, Yeonju was gone. The new chapter of W stunned him. The murderer is a cold-blooded murderer. He existed to kill Kang Chun's family. Now that Yeonju wore a wedding ring, she was part of Kang Chun's family, so the murderer had to kill her. He pulled the trigger and killed Yeonju. Kang Chun couldn't accept this ending. He decided to return to the comic world to confront the murderer. When the two enemies met, they were filled with rage. They had the same purpose to kill each other. They rush forward with the mindset that they will stab the opponent to death, and then they crazily open fire. Neither of them could dodge the bullets. However, compared to an Olympic shooting champion, the murderer was far inferior. All of the murderer's body was wounded and finally died. When Kang Chun rushed to the storehouse, he saw only a blood stain on the ground, but no sign of Yeonju. It turned out that when the words "bore to be continued" appeared, Yeonju had returned to the real world and was taken to the hospital by passers-by. The initial diagnosis was brain death. After the murderer died, the author's face was finally restored. When Sang-boon heard that his daughter was in a coma, the real problem was that his mind was still influenced by the murderer's consciousness. He always thought he was the one who killed his daughter. Upon regaining consciousness, Sang-boon attempted to jump from a building, but Kang Chun stopped him in time. Kang Chun then brought Yeonju back to the comic world, but she died after opening her eyes once. However, the situation could still be improved. Even though the tablet was damaged, it turned out that the murderer had previously instructed the author to draw a duplicate of the tablet and hide it in the trunk of a car. But coincidentally, after the murderer was shot by Kang Chun, the congressman arrived at the scene and destroyed the evidence against him. The congressman also found the duplicate tablet in the murderer's car trunk and took it home. He suspected that the tablet was something important, so he did something with it and quickly discovered its hidden secret. When Kang Chun arrived to find it, the congressman stabbed him. This was a miraculous tablet. Whatever you wanted could be created, even more conveniently than Ma Lian's magic brush. But the congressman wondered what principle this device operated on. Was he now living in a magical world? Seeing Kang Chun refuse to talk, the congressman struck him with a rod. Severely beaten, Kang Chun finally muttered two words: the hospital. The congressman now realized the power of the tablet. Kang Chun said he needed the tablet to save his deceased wife. The tablet's owner was at the hospital. As long as the one who appears the dead can be revived. The congressman found it absurd, but in his heart he was quite concerned. He ordered his men to verify Yeonju's death, then brought the tablet to the hospital and followed Kang Chun's instructions to find the author named Sang-boon for answers. After the congressman left the Baosling, to be continued text appeared. Kang Chun, who was bound, suddenly disappeared. He returned to the real world. At the same time, the student Su Bong, who had been waiting, finally saw the latest chapter of the comic. Kang Chun in the story was sending a signal to him. Kang Chun instructed Su Bong and the author to go to the hospital to retrieve the drawing board. Since Kang Chun was a real person now, he could call upon characters from the comic. Now he will summon the prosecutor Han Chul-ho into the real world. Meanwhile, the scene around the congressman began to change, and he unexpectedly saw the author who had created him. Before he could understand what was happening, Subong unexpectedly snatched the drawing board. The author rushed over and struck the congressman with an IV pole to knock him out. Then the author quickly turned on the drawing board to create a new plotline to revive his daughter in the story. Thus Yeonju miraculously woke up. The mouth to be continued text appeared. Yeonju safely returned to the real world, while Yeonju was waiting for Kang Chun outside the hotel. Not long after she saw the secretary Soo-hee, at that moment the text, "Final chapter," unexpectedly appeared. That's right, she was once again summoned into the comic world. At the same time, the author's hands became transparent because the story had opened up its true ending. Kang Chun's consciousness in the comic had been awakened and came to the real world, which inadvertently disrupted the law of conservation of energy and required the real-world characters to pay the price. The three key characters in the real world were all summoned into the comic world. The author was the first to enter the comic world, where the murderer's consciousness became even stronger. The author was completely controlled, with two personalities continuously switching, and after spending a year at the mental hospital in the story, the author became even more like the murderer, and he became one of the comic characters. The murderer is about to disappear, so during a medication change, the murderer killed a nurse so that he could avoid vanishing quickly. Before entering the comic world, the author had drawn a duplicate of the office and the drawing board. After escaping from the mental hospital, he hid in this office and even tied himself up to avoid losing control, and painfully waited for Kang Chun and Yeonju's whereabouts. The second person to enter the comic world was Kang Chun. He coincidentally encountered the congressman who threw him in front of the clinic. Then Kang Chun was then taken for emergency treatment because Kang Chun intentionally faked his death, so he was forced to go to jail. When Yeonju arrived late, he was sentenced to death. However, while he was standing before Yeonju, he appeared remarkably calm, as if death was a trivial matter to him, because the story was coming to an end, so there are no more new chapters. Until everything was finished, no one could return to the real world. At that moment, a key unexpectedly appeared on Kang Chun's handcuffs, and a gun appeared in his hand. Kang Chun realized the author was helping him escape from prison. After successfully escaping, he met Yeonju at the author's office as planned. While Yeonju was cooking, the author revealed some things to Kang Chun. No matter what, he could not coexist with Kang Chun's happy ending, because the murderer's consciousness had invaded half of his body. In a way, he was also the murderer. If he lived another day, Kang Chul and Yeonju would be in danger for another day. Even if he returned to the real world, he could never go back to the way he was before. The murderer had used Sang-boon's hand to commit murder. To destroy everything, the murderer's soul had become more brutal than ever. There was still a villain in the story that needed to be dealt with. That's the congressman. With the upcoming general election, the congressman was constantly putting on a show of excellence in front of the media. When the congressman knew that Kang Chun had escaped, he was furious and directly kidnapped Kang Chun's bodyguard and beated him to death. The congressman took the phone of Kang Chun's bodyguard and sent a message to Kang Chun, saying his bodyguard had been kidnapped. Kang Chun was extremely worried, so he ran outside to call the congressman. But when he returned to the room, the author was crazily choking Yeonju. And no mistakes, Sang-boon's consciousness was invaded by the murderer again. Kang Chun was so helpless that he could only continue to tie Sang-boon to the bed. When Sang-boon regained consciousness, seeing the marks on his daughter's neck made him heartbroken. Though they did not speak anything, Sang-boon knew what he had done. Because Sang-boon killed the nurse, the police are on their way to find him. Sang-boon now was imprisoned in the murderer's setup. If Sang-boon did not commit murder, he would soon disappear. Between Kang Chun and Sang-boon, either one would survive or both would vanish. At this point, the police had surrounded the entire house. Yeonju had drawn the house into a confined space to buy time. Kang Chun led her to the back door. He removed her wedding ring. If Yeonju were not his family, no matter how the outcome turned out, she would not be targeted by the murderer. After taking Yeonju back, Kang Chun quickly went to rescue his bodyguard. He took out a USB and confronted the congressman. The USB contained videos of the congressman's illegal activities. Kang Chun warned the congressman not to harm his loved ones if the congressman still wanted to maintain fame and fortune. Unexpectedly, the congressmen were even more brutal. He shot Kang Chun directly. Compared to the general election, he cared more about the existence of another world. Kang Chun fought desperately. While fleeing, his car suddenly ran out of gas. He weakly called Yeonju. She quickly drew a car to find Kang Chun. Kang Chun now was covered in injuries. He began to vomit blood, but Yeonju was still on the way. Kang Chun began to lose consciousness. As she was nearing him, more vehicles passed by. Yeonju was extremely panicked and kept calling Kang Chun's name. Finally, Kang Chun fell down, and at the crucial moment, a truck passed by. Before Yeonju could reach him, she was back in the real world. The end of the comic W concluded with Kang Chun's death. However, Sang-boon had not yet reappeared. Yeonju's wedding ring and Sang-boon's drawing board had disappeared. She and Subong printed many missing person flyers and distributed them everywhere to find Sang-boon's whereabouts. It seemed like a tragic ending, but the outcome was reversed. Although the comic had ended, it did not mean that the comic world had stopped. Sang-boon had heard that Kang-chun was shot dead, so he quickly arranged. Sang-boon gave the bodyguard an anesthetic. He chose to sacrifice himself to revive Kang-chun's life. He picked up his pen and draw the congressman's death. Sang-boon published the congressman's farewell letter and recorded videos about his illegal work. When the police arrived, the USB and the farewell letter would clear Kang-chun's name. Yeonju did not know that while she was giving her all for Kang-chun, her father was watching her one last time from afar. Kang-chun was not the cause of the comic's ending. Rather, it was the punishment for evil that had been carried out. Sang-boon violated the murderer's setup and completed a happy ending for Kang-chun. Kang-chun did not die. After the emergency treatment, he still had to go to prison. Of course, because of last time he faked his own death, and also for stealing a gun and escaping from prison. But the murder charges were cleared. In the retrial, Kang-chun was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Sang-boon left him a photo and a letter. At the end of the story, Kang-chun had canceled the main character's setup while Sang-boon was imprisoned by his own drawings and then died. Kang-chun left the comic world, and Sang-boon became the main character of the comic world. Looking back at the W comic he had devoted his life to, Sang-boon hoped Yeonju and Kang-chun would live happily together. To conclude W with a fitting ending, Kang-chun really did serve 2 years in prison. After his release, he returned to the real world to live with Yeonju. He gave her Sang-boon's photo and said nothing more. He and Yeonju became a normal couple, living together through the days ahead. The film ends here. Thank you for following along. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.